But back to the question of the day. What was the impact of Stalinism since 1953? It's most important to remember that while Stalin and the system he had created caused enormous suffering, he had far more supporters than detractors at the time of his death. The announcement of his death in 1953 brought a genuine popular outpouring of grief and fear for the future. There were certainly those who celebrated the passing of an evil tyrant. Now, just as there had been no obvious successor to Lenin after his death in 1924, there wasn't an obvious successor to Stalin in 1953. And just as everybody ganged up on Trotsky in the 1920s, it was Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's head of the political police, that everyone wanted to see the back of in the 1950s. And to that end, they resorted to Stalinist methods, arresting him and shooting him without trial. Now, while Nikita Khrushchev ultimately replaced Stalin as leader of the USSR, his victory was no foregone conclusion. As in the Lenin succession, there was a measure of patronage politics involved, that is, backroom politics and exchanges of political favors. But there was also a measure of a gathering of support through what we would recognize as, broadly speaking, a democratic means, that is, putting forward a policy platform, not so much to gain the support of the population at large, as it was gaining the support of, say, the top 1,000 or so officials who were in some position to influence the outcome of the struggle. So Khrushchev won the leadership by offering a good mixture of reform and conservatism, promising to keep the good bits of Stalinism while getting rid of the bad bits. At least that was the way it worked in theory. In practice, it was a very tricky game. Khrushchev's main opponent, Malenkov, had promised to cut back on investment in heavy industry and to develop the production of consumer goods. But in doing so, he managed to offend a large number of officials, both in central ministries and in the regions, who led the massive heavy industrial sector. Khrushchev was very careful not to challenge vested interests. Khrushchev's strategy was very much about addressing the legacy of Stalinism. To put it simply, if a little crudely, Khrushchev asserted that there was nothing wrong with the system that Stalin had created, in the sense of a planned economy, collective agriculture, and the emphasis on heavy industry. But he blamed Stalin personally, or to use his phrase, Stalin's cult of personality, for everything that went wrong, and especially for the violence of the period. Again, to use his phrase, for the excesses of the Stalin period. Khrushchev promised that there would be no return to mass repression. He gradually reduced the population of the labor camps of the Gulag. He expanded the realm of permitted dissent in a phenomenon called the thaw, the central pillar of which was de-stalinization, or a criticism of Stalin's cult of personality. It was a pretty clever strategy, but fundamentally disingenuous or insincere. You couldn't so simply separate the good bits of Stalinism from the bad bits. It just wasn't that simple. And the bad bits didn't follow only from Stalin and his cult of personality. The failure of Khrushchev's strategy was not, in the end, a direct consequence of his de-Stalinization, of his criticism of Stalin. He was removed from his post as General Secretary of the party in 1964 because his positive policy program had failed. In foreign policy, the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis had been grave embarrassment for the Soviet Union internationally. In agriculture, the positive results of his ambitious Virgin Lands program were extremely short-lived. And perhaps more significantly, his plans for improving administrative efficiency, first decentralizing in the Sovnarkhoz reforms and then re-centralizing in the Supreme Economic Council, were disruptive and without measurable benefit. When Leonid Brezhnev took over in 1964, he promised to end the sorts of poorly thought through reforms characteristic of the Khrushchev era. He returned foursquare to the essence of the economic and political system that Stalin had created in the 1930s. And Brezhnev also took the opportunity to put an end to de-Stalinization. The political police was strengthened. The realm of permitted dissent was narrowed. There was no return to mass repression, but the public criticism of Stalin and the Stalin era more or less disappeared from public discourse. And out of this we got, for the next 20 years, what Gorbachev referred to later as the era of stagnation. Now let me talk a bit about the popular image of Stalinism, having given you the sense of the official version of the Stalin era. What did the public think about Stalin and Stalinism? This is a fascinating story that historians are only now addressing. Certainly, through much of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the default assumption of Soviet experts was that the public generally hated the inefficient, corrupt, and repressive system that they lived under, that they would have preferred something more capitalistic, a kind of liberal democracy such as their counterparts in the West enjoyed. In fact, this was largely untrue. Of course, when discussing the opinions of 200 million people, you can expect and should expect diversity. Generally speaking, though, there were three axes of opinion. Okay? First, we should think of the less educated people to more educated people, then the young to the old, and the rural to the urban, the three axes. The less educated, the older, and the more rural were most likely to support an authoritarian interventionist state of the Stalinist stripe. They were the least bothered by censorship and the persecution of dissent. But the better educated, the younger urbanites, especially those living in Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, were most likely to want a freedom of expression and more market forces in the economy. They were not big fans of Stalin and anything that smacked of Stalinism, at least as Khrushchev had criticized it. They were the group that was most annoyed by Brezhnev's era of stagnation. And yet you need to be careful about how you interpret the data. The young, urban, educated group was relatively small. And even they broadly supported what we might call welfare state socialism. They did not want capitalism as they understood it. And they were pretty relaxed about the one-party state and the centrally planned economy. That is the outlines of the Stalinist system. As long as that system provided a gradual rising standard of living, free healthcare, guaranteed housing, and general political stability. So when Gorbachev came to power, he knew he had to shake things up. Not because there was some groundswell of political opposition to the regime, far from it. Rather, Gorbachev had reason to be worried about the fact that the economy had failed to muster any significant economic growth for 2 decades. The Soviet Union was slipping farther and farther behind the United States. Gorbachev needed to fight corruption and vested interests. Perhaps he needed to introduce new material incentives to labor, some limited market forces. But he didn't need to or want to change the Soviet system he inherited ultimately from Stalin. His problem was not a public clamor for change, but the strength of resistance to it, especially from within the party and the administrative establishment. Gorbachev thus invoked glasnost, or greater freedom of expression, in order to rally popular opinion against corruption and conservatism. He attempted to create a new power base outside the old party and state structures. But that did not strengthen his political hand as he had hoped. Rather, his changes undermined the coherence of central policy making. And what happened towards the end of the 1980s is that politics in the Soviet Union descended into confusion, and the economy drifted into a tailspin. In August 1991, conservatives within the old party structures made a last-ditch effort to restore the old order by launching a coup. It failed when the army refused to support it. And at that stage, power passed from the USSR-wide structures, the old Soviet government, to the regional structures that Gorbachev had strengthened. And Boris Yeltsin was perhaps the most powerful of these as President of Russia, as he'd become in the late 1980s. Now, Yeltsin opted to reverse the collapse of the Soviet economy by dismantling the Stalinist planned economy in favor of a rapid transition to capitalism. And this, it must be noted, was no cause for public celebration. In fact, quite the opposite was the case, though a lot of that was actually Yeltsin's fault. The process by which state assets were privatized was deeply corrupt, so that, as you may know, the wealth of the nation fell to the ownership of a handful of so-called oligarchs, the Khodorkovskys, the Deripaskas, the Abramoviches, or Abramovich, as we know him, and so on. More significantly, for the majority of the population, the elements of the old Stalinist system that the majority of the population held dear, that is, the welfare state socialism, were dismantled in the transition to capitalism. So guarantees of jobs were replaced with mounting unemployment. Guarantees of housing were dropped. The quality of healthcare plummeted. Living standards continued to fall as prices rose and the gap between the rich and the poor stretched to unprecedented levels. A transition to capitalism and democracy was never going to be easy, but Boris Yeltsin mishandled it in the 1990s, and it became tainted. So let's go back to the big question, the impact of Stalin and Stalinism since 1953, by thinking a bit about Putin's Russia. Now, when I teach 20th century Russian history to my undergraduates here at the University of Leeds, they think that the system collapsed in 1991 because people were completely fed up with Soviet socialism and that they wanted some kind of liberal democracy. And the fact of the matter is that if you look at the Putin era, we see very much a tightening of political control, a return to authoritarianism, and an authoritarianism that is broadly popular, particularly so in the immediate years after Yeltsin's disastrous experience. And what we have to think about here is not only that after Gorbachev's glasnost, Gorbachev's openness, and that renewed criticism of the Stalin era, that criticism stops again. So under Putin, it's not so much that we get a re-Stalinization, but certainly a glorification of the iron hand. Yeah? When we think about the legacy of Stalinism, we have to think about how tolerant the Russian population is of authoritarian government. And we can think about that as an impact of Stalinism, but in fact it goes farther back than that, and not just to Leninism, but indeed to centuries of an authoritarian tradition in Russia. And I suppose the conclusion of conclusions really is that we can identify some kind of Stalinism, but it is exceptionally difficult to talk about a discrete legacy of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. Thanks.